Hello, everyone. Hope everyone is okay. Let's go for the last GTO Wizard coaching of the year. Hope you guys have had a great year. Hope you've also decided to take some days off to rest. It's important. Let's do this today for the last class. All right. Some familiar faces around. Let's do this. So today we're going to talk about a topic that was suggested by one of GTO Wizard users in the weekly coachings channel, Lisandro Giacconi. He requested a topic, finding unnatural bluff spots. I thought that was cool because it's definitely something most people struggle with, to find the proper amount or the proper hand selection related to bluffs in a lot of spots. So it makes up for a very interesting and also important topic to be covered. So let's jump into it. I picked a few examples that I think can highlight this potential problem in your guys' games, in everyone's games. I think the examples I'm going to show, I feel like 98% of the field struggles with them. And it's understandable why people struggle with this, including myself, to be honest. And we're going to try and understand why that is the case and how we can solve that problem. Of course, most important thing is to learn something from this, not just be aware that we're making that mistake. Okay, so natural bluffing spots. Now, before I share my screen and show you guys the examples that I picked, why don't you guys start out telling me what are the spots that you feel like certainly require unnatural bluffing from any given player compared to what humans are usually capable or interested in doing so? What are the spots that come up in your mind that require these unusual bluffs in you guys' opinion? Let's start off with that. Let's see what's the general consensus about this topic, and then we can jump into my examples. No one has any ideas? Okay. Stephen said, when villain dunk bets on the river. So what do you mean? As the dunk better, it's difficult to find the bluffs? Is that it? Tom said, 3-betting rivers. It's all value at low mid stakes. So you don't learn from natural experience. Interesting. That's a very specific line, right? So it's no surprise that people would struggle to find bluffs there. It's so rare. Vinny said, find bluffs versus larger sizes. Okay. Balaj said, when the ranges are wide, for example, BVB. So a lot of different situations being mentioned here. Tom said, facing range batters on the flop in 3-bet pots IP. Yeah, that's a decent example. For sure, there are some raises there that most people struggle to find. Okay. No one mentioned any specific textures, so that's interesting to me. I would expect you guys to mention some specific textures. And that's exactly how I'm going to start this class, by showing you guys textures where certainly most people are struggling to find bluffs, and then you could call it unnatural bluffing spots. So we're not going to focus necessarily in this or that spot, but you're going to see that we're going to see many different spots, and certain textures are going to exhibit these issues more often than others. Okay, so the most significant textures, the most significant texture in which this problem occurs is ace high textures. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I think you guys can see it right now. I'm gonna put this on the bottom. And ace high textures are certainly the most difficult ones to find bluffs. And that's gonna be the case for a couple of reasons. One of those reasons is that a lot of ace high textures are very disconnected. And generally, you're not going to have many natural bluffs or draws at your disposal. Okay, so let's take a look at this spot here. We open 2.5 on the button, get 3-bet from the small blind, and call the 3-bet, and we get this ace 9-3 rainbow flop. The small blind checks to us. Okay, villain can see bet at a very high frequency here, and most people are probably going to see bet entire range. But let's say villain checks to us. What are the types of hands that you guys are usually stabbing here on the flop? So tell me quickly a list of hands that you think are pretty appropriate to be using as stabs on this flop here, for example. Paul also said, let's say paired ace high board, UTG versus big blind single raise pot, you need to overbet a crazy amount. Okay, so he mentioned ace high and paired boards. Paired boards are definitely the case as well, where again, you have a limited amount of natural bluffing hands or draws that you can use. So you have to find some other types of hands. Right? But what about this flop here? What kinds of hands are you guys usually betting with on this flop? We have the most obvious ones, right? For example, 5-4, it's a good shot. Overcard with backdoor combos, said Stephen. Okay, so maybe stuff like Jack 10 of spades, Queen 10 of spades, right? There can only be an overcard to middle pair, so Jack 10 of spades, Queen 10 of spades, Queen Jack of spades, Diamond hearts, all those kinds of hands. Okay, those would be options. What else? What else do you guys are stabbing here with if you were in the button shoes? Low pocket pairs, said Balaj. Nice. This heuristic is a very common one for ace high boards. So using hands like deuces and fours here is quite nice. Because you have unblockers to your opponent's folding range, you can sometimes improve to a deceptive nuts that can stack your opponent. And you're going to need it for board coverage. That's something we're going to talk a lot about in this topic of unnatural bluff spots, which is board coverage. A lot of these unnatural bluffs, they happen because of the necessity of having board coverage, the necessity of having sufficient bluffing hands across all potential runouts. Okay, this is why we're going to see these different hand combinations, which seem very weird at first glance, but they are necessary to achieve an equilibrium. So, okay, backdoors, draws, and low pocket pairs. So those are hands that I would always expect people to find in the spot. When you take a look at the buttons range here, you see that there are other hand categories that are not really so obvious. So for instance, you're gonna have hands like 7-6 suited here, stabbing very frequently. So half of the time, you should go ahead and bet half pot with 7-6. Well, it has backdoors, right? So it's not like it's completely out of nowhere, but it doesn't have an overcard, and the backdoors are not really that strong. but you do have to go ahead and fire 7-6 here. And then even a hand as strong as pocket sixes should start betting here. So most people maybe could find deuces and fours, but then fives and even up to pocket sixes should start betting here very, very frequently, something like 40% of the time. You have also some middle pairs getting used here. You're going to see that this type of hand is going to be used as a bluff in high card runouts. Those are going to be basically semi-bluffs. You have outs to make trips or two pair, and you have decent blockers to some of your opponent's slow plays. So these types of hands also get used at some frequency. And the hands that Stephen mentioned also go into this range some of the time. We see the clear preference for having the backdoor flush draw. Having clubs is not so nice. We use it infrequently. But we're going to have this category. We're going to have this category of low pairs, and also this category of complete air and some second pairs here that you're going to be bluffing on later streets. So look at what happens on the queen turn, for example. You bet the flop, villain calls, the turn comes a queen. You still have to fire those hands at very significant frequency. So take a look at 6-5, for example, complete total air in the spot, but you have to continue firing it something like 75% of the time on the aggregate here. Stuff like 7-6, you have to fire half of the time still again here on the turn. And 9-8, you continue firing as well very frequently. So you can definitely expect most people to not find these bets, and then you should correctly adjust and overfold to those people who are not finding these bets. And if you study a little bit of population tendencies, you see that in fact people do overfold a lot on these types of textures, and they are making a correct adjustment against the field simply because people are not finding these complete air bets. So what's going to happen in most runouts is that they're going to lack bluffs, and therefore you should not call your bluff catchers. Okay, so these types of hands, they are necessary to achieve balance across multiple runouts. And if you take a look at the other candidates in your range, they are not good bets at all. This is going to be the case on these boards where you have a very specific portion of your opponent's range that compose their folding region. So the out of position folding region here is going to contain a lot of these high cards, king highs, and then pocket kings, pocket queens, and that stuff. Pocket queens, no, because it's set, but pocket kings, pocket jacks. So having these high cards here between the 10 and the king is not good at all. So these would be minus EV bets. These hands, they prefer to check and realize equity. So you do have other candidates, but they are so bad that you need to use these other hands. So you prefer to bet with a hand like 6-5 here than you would with a hand like king 10. Okay, this is something that people usually get it backwards as well. They think king 10, king jack is a better bluff here, and they fire that just because it has a gut shot, and then they don't fire this type of air here. What's going to happen is that on king jack 10 runouts, they completely lack the bluffing hands, and then you correctly overfold your ace king on those runouts because people don't have bluffs. Now, what you want to do is you don't want to be the guy who under bluffs and then lets population overfold. If your opponents are overfolding, you cannot play in a way that you allow them to correctly exploit you. Okay, so you have to make sure you are finding these bets, because otherwise you're going to get exploited in some runouts, and people will be doing so, and correctly they're going to be negating EV to the top of your range. Okay, so don't make the mistake of just barreling these types of hands. You would already be losing EV by doing that in the first place, because you not get the necessary fold equity with these types of hands. And then you're also going to lose EV by not getting value from the top of your range, because people are going to overfold. Okay, so ace high boards are the most important example you're going to find, okay? Stephen said, I've noticed this a lot when using the range builder, betting with a 5-4, 6-5 air type hands with the high frequency. Yes, that's going to happen quite a lot. Even in single raised pots, you're going to see some high card boards where you have to find those 5-4, 6-5 type hands. In single raise pots, they usually have the benefit of blocking top pairs still. So you can bluff king 5-4 and a king high board and block king 5, king 4. So that's good. But overall, it's almost guaranteed that you're going to have some frequency of those hands to guarantee board coverage in the runouts that complete the natural draws. That's the problem with most people. They just focus on bluffing the draws. And when the draws complete, everyone overfolds, and then everyone is losing EV by not being able to balance their value region on the runouts that completes the draws. Okay, so make sure you find these hands. If you spend some time browsing these sims, you will be able to come up with heuristics. You see that pretty much every time it's going to be mixed. It's rare that you're going to have a total air hand being a pure strategy. You're going to have those hands at some frequency to guarantee board coverage in the necessary runouts. Okay, so you shouldn't bet all the time, but you should bet sometimes with those types of hands. Okay. What's more important, said Tom, the overall bluff value split or the blockers? Let me sure if I get this question. Okay, I think I can answer it in a coherent way. So if you were around, we made a coaching class, I think 2 months ago, on the toy game of the polarized versus bluff catcher over a 2-street game, right? So we were on the turn and we were making calculations about how to predict how many bluffs or what's the correct proportion of bluffs in the better's range in that toy game. So we started on the turn with the polarized range, and we had to figure out how many bluffs to carry from the turn to the river. In that situation, there were no blocker effects. So no hand in each player's range were interacting with the other player's range. So there, the only thing that matters is the proportion, is to guarantee that you give up the necessary amount of time to give your opponent incentive to call on the current street. However, in real poker, you always have removal interactions. You always have blocker effects going on. And what's going to happen is that the worst blocker hands in your range are going to be they're not going to maximize their EV as bets. They're likely to be better as checks. So you always have to consider blockers in your thought process. Okay, so it's pretty much never the case that you can dismiss blocker effects in your bluff range construction. Okay, so make sure you're always thinking about that. And the way to correctly think about that is project what your opponent's folding range is going to be versus the sizing you want to pick. So here, for example, we're going to pick half pot as our only sizing on this run out. And then you have to think, okay, what is the bulk of my opponent's folding range versus sizing? And then you have to figure out which hands do not block that region, because the hands that heavily block that region are likely to be pure checks. That's the case here with hands like King Jack and King 10. Okay. One thing that can happen though is your opponent can be bluffing with hands that he should not bluff, but he could be bluffing them way too much. So he could be bluffing with hands that, because of the blocks, they should be checked, but he could be using them excessively. He could be using them in a way that his overall proportion is out of the allowed amount. And therefore, you would want to overcall against him. You would want to probably overraise against that profile. A very good exploitative adjustment against people who are betting way too many draws is to fast play your good hands. Okay. You do not want to let villain get away with realizing his equity with all his draws. So if your opponent is betting way too many draws, the correct exploitative adjustment is to over raise or to fast play more with your strong hands. Okay, so always consider how your opponents are likely constructing their ranges. Okay, so that's the first example here for the spot ace high boards. I have another spot here for ace high boards as well. So imagine you have now a button versus big blind situation. The same board I think I picked, or almost the same board, ace 9-2 rainbow. The button is going to bet the flop. Here you're already going to notice something important, which is the fact that the button cannot bet any 2 cards on this flop. The button has to check 40% of the time here. You could be facing opponents that are betting way too much on these kinds of textures, and you should adjust by both over raising and over calling. Okay. One thing that's going to happen when your opponent c-bets any two cards here is that his check back frequency on the turn is going to be super high. He's going to bet all hands. He's not going to be able to continue betting the pocket pairs, and let alone all the air that he's going to have. So he's going to check back 75, 80% of the time on the turn, which obviously allows you to realize equity and see more rivers. So if your opponent is c-betting too much, you should adjust by raising more and also floating more. Okay, that's certainly going to be the case at low and mid stakes on these ace high boards. But that's not the topic of today. Let's go to the turn. The turn is a jack, and the button is going to build his bluffing range. And again, you will see those hands that may seem crazy. They're going to appear here in the spot as well. And for a lot of people, if you encounter someone doing this, you might insta-label them as spewy because it's so unnatural for us to think that this is a good play, but it is a necessary play. So take a look at this range composition here. You have the obvious hands that anyone would choose. So hands like Queen 10, it's an open-ender. Queen 8 is a gut shot, pretty straightforward. 10-8, open-ender, pretty straightforward. You have a hand like 8-7, it's a gut shot. Maybe some people would not pure bet it, but certainly they would bet it sometimes. But then if you go down here, you start to see hands that for most people are going to be very unnatural. So you would take a random hand like 6-5 and you overbet it 70% of the time. You take a random hand like 6-4 suited and you overbet it like 90% of the time. You do the same with 7-5 suited, 7-6 suited. You have a gut shot here with the 5-4 and the pocket pairs that you guys are already familiar with, 4s, 3s, and deuces is a set. So 3s and 4s here also at some frequency. But for a lot of people, these hands here like 6-4, what are you doing here? If you call down and see someone showing up 6-4 here, a lot of people could just insta-label as spewy, but it is a necessary hand here to contain in your bluffing range. And this is because if you take a look at these natural draws, all of them interact with similar cards, right? They're going to interact with the queen, with the 10, with the king. So on those runouts, if you lack these kinds of bluffs, you're going to become imbalanced. And that's exactly what happens in practice. Let's say that the river comes at 10, and you're going to have all these hands you want to value bet, right? So you have hands like Queen 8, you want to value bet even for an all-in sizing. You have hands like Ace Jack that you want to value bet. It's still pretty much the nuts at this point. You have hands like sets, and then you're going to shove. And because you lack those bluffs in your range, or I didn't talk about the king highs. So the king highs here as well. So you have hands like King 3, King 4, King 5, all barreling at decent amounts here. You should and you have to have those hands in your range at some frequency. The deuce X, I think people at mid stakes are finding those almost always. Maybe at low stakes, some people are not finding, but at mid stakes and high stakes, people are finding those King deuce, and Queen deuce. And then that's what you're going to have to use on those runouts. So when the river comes at 10, you're going to have to draw bluffs from the king highs. You're going to have to bluff the 7-6, even pure, some of those with pure bets like 7-6 of spades, pure shoving or pure betting, 7-6 of diamonds, pure betting, 7-5 also getting used. So if you lack those hands, basically you're not going to be able to balance your value region. You're going to shove here as you should with your value, and people are going to correctly overfold. No one is going to call you here with Ace 7. No one's going to call you here with Ace 8 because you're not giving them incentive to do so. You don't have the necessary amount of bluffs, and then you lose value with the top of your range. Okay, so you don't want to be the guy that gets exploited because people are correctly overfolding. Okay. Pullback set, I have a 30K hand sample at 100 and 200 zoom, and my red line is completely out of control. Do you think there's population you can get away over bluffing, like bluffing every equity draw because people don't raise enough? Depends on the line, okay? Depends on the line. There are some lines that solver doesn't even raise much to begin with, like with big bets. You shouldn't, both OOP and IP player shouldn't really cap their range by raising the top. So against big bets, you almost don't see raises. In a lot of spots, you already have a very low raising frequency from solver, like 5% of the time. So I don't think people are too bad at finding the raises in most situations because it's not difficult to do so in most spots. But on flop situations, I think people are still relatively poor at constructing their raises, particularly out of position. In position as well, but particularly out of position in some textures, like paired textures, for example, low textures. People should raise like 20% of the time, they raise much less. So in those, it's okay to be a little bit more aggressive, but overall, I would say not much room to exploit that way. But red line is about many other things, not just bluffing. So don't be too concerned about that. Are those low bluffs just for board coverage, or do you need some low equity garbage to disincentive villain from raising too much? Asked Tom. Let's go back here to just when we use those strong words, I'm always going to answer no, because we have so many variables going on here at Equilibrium that it would be silly to assume that certain strategy is just because that one given variable. What we know, for example, from studying that toy game, that static toy game that we studied a couple months ago, is that a lot of your bluff hand selection also has to do with how much equity your opponent's bluff catchers are going to have versus your check back range. Okay, so we talked about this as well. We used the king high board example. So I'm going to go back to that example. Actually, I can do it here quickly because it can refresh our minds about what you're asking. So we use the example of a button versus big blind situation, and you have a king nine deuce board, or it was king 7 deuce, I don't know. And then the turn was either a 7 or a 9, one of the two. So let's assume that here it was a 7. So here what you're going to see is that the 9x for OOP is going to be indifferent versus a large bet. So we're going to overbet here, and the 9x combos are going to be indifferent. They're going to call sometimes, fold sometimes. Now, not only is it important that you have the correct proportion of bluffs, but it's also important that you have the correct hand selection such that the equity of your opponent's bluff catches versus your check back range is appropriate. Because the way your opponent wins when he calls is by when you check back the river and he wins at showdown. However, you're going to have some bet checks that beats your opponent's bluff catchers. For example, you're going to overbet king 10 here on the turn, and then you're going to check that king 10 in a lot of different runouts where you can't value bet that hand. So it's not like 9x is going to have 100% equity versus your check back range. So you need to make sure that you have the exact hand selection that allows for 9x to have sufficient equity versus your check back range. And that's exactly why you can't bet these hands at pure frequency. For example, you can't bet these gut shots with 2 overcards at pure frequency, because otherwise in a lot of runouts, 9x is not going to have sufficient equity versus your check back range. So that's also a very important variable of choosing these low equity bluffs here. These low equity bluffs, they're also going to serve as hands that can lower your equity versus your opponent's bluff catchers when you check back, so that your check back range is not too strong. Okay, because you're going to see that you're not going to be able to bet those hands every time anyways. So we saw here on the ace high board, you're going to have to give up 7-5 some of the times. You're going to have to give up 7-6 some of the times. 6-5 here is pure checking. 6-4 is pure checking. So if you play a strategy where you only bet overcards to the 9, for example, then in a lot of different runouts, 9x is not going to win against your checkbacks. And again, he's not going to have incentive to call you. Okay. So that, I think, answers part of your question. Now, disincentivizing villain from raising too much. Well, you certainly become exploitable, as I said, if you just bet draws, right? If you just bet draws, then villain is going to start fast playing his strongest hands. So certainly, I guess you're right in your question. Basically, you can't build an unexploitable strategy without using these hands. And one reason for that is that not using these hands makes your opponent incentivized to just raise his value hands. Okay, so for sure that's one point, but as I said, there are many variables at plays here. All right, so ace high boards are a very significant, basically in any spot, ace high boards, people are probably going to struggle to do this, and you're probably struggling yourself, and you should correct this ASAP. And you should correct this ASAP because remember, ace high boards are the most common boards in the game. Okay, you can combine an ace with any other card on the board, so that makes that ace high textures have more combinations than any other texture. So if you're making constant mistakes in the most common texture of the game, you're obviously going to be bleeding EV. Okay, so you don't want to be the guy that doesn't bluff and lets opponents overfold. Okay, so make sure you find these hands. And as I said, you can't fix this. Like, you can't just, oh, I'm going to increase the frequency of my draws, because there will be runouts where you're going to be exploitable. Okay, so you can't fix this by just increasing the frequency of the natural bluffs. You have to include those if you want to be unexploitable on the draw completing runouts. Okay, so ace high boards, the first example. The second example here is the same line, and now turnover cards are situations where you're going to see this fairly often. Okay, turnover cards are going to be naturally situations where the aggressor has an advantage. So here, for example, on the turn king, we have the same spot, button raise big blind, single raise spot. You see bet high frequency on dry queen high board, turn comes a king. Obviously, you have an advantage here. You have a lot of king highs, ace, king, kings, aces. Your opponent doesn't have most of those hands. So we're barreling here quite frequently for the average of the spot, 52% of the time. This is much more than the average. And you're using a lot of 175 over bets here. If you take a look at the range construction, again, you see the necessity for using hands that are complete air. So here you're going to use the hands that are very easy for most people. So Jack 10, 10 9, Jack 9s are gut shots, Ace Jack, Ace 10, pretty straightforward. But then you see also some hands that may not be very obvious for most people. So you have a random 7-5 suited thrown in the mix very frequently, in fact, like half of the time. You're going to see ace highs getting bluffed here, ace 5, ace 4. A lot of people are missing those, and this is going to have very significant impacts on some runouts. So ace 5, ace 4 off here, almost at pure frequency. You have to bluff those hands on the king high board. And then some random jack highs. So jack 4 suited, jack 5 suited. Some random 10 highs, 10 7 suited, 10 8 suited. So what happens on these runouts is, of course, you have a very big amount of value combos. And you have many different types of categories of potential rivers, right? So you're going to have the blank rivers. So on the blank rivers, you're going to have some of those hands, because a lot of these draws, they may interact poorly with your opponent's folding range. So you want to have some of those hands for the blank runouts. And on the overcard or pairing runouts, imagine the river comes a king or an ace. You're also going to need these random airs as well to not interact with your opponent's folding range. So this is something also that it is from my experience, a fact that people are missing a lot. And this, again, has many potential exploitative problems that can happen for someone who is not finding these. And this is a particularly sensitive situation because you have a lot of value combos. So you want to make sure you get value from those. So if all of a sudden you're not putting the necessary amount and hand selection of bluffs in your range and allowing your opponent to overfold in a situation where you have a lot of value, that obviously has repercussions to your EV. Okay, so turnover cards are also very, very, how can I say, typical situations where you need to find at least a medium to low frequency of these random airs in your range. Okay, like 8-7 suited, 25% of the time you have to find here. You know, so these kinds of stuffs only the very best players are currently finding, which obviously gives them a little bit of an edge on these situations. Okay. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask. I'm just going through the examples here. And you not only have bad examples, but also raise examples. And those are the ones that even high stakes players definitely struggle with. And this obviously generates an opportunity for edge as well. So let's see an example of a 3-bet pot where you have a low board. So this is 3-bet pot, small blind versus button. We are the small blind, okay, in this example. You have this 10 high rainbow flop. You're going to see bet here, either half pot or 2/3. Any is fine. Villain is going to call, and then you're going to get this 3 of spade turn. The first thing you're going to see here on these kinds of boards and runouts, you're going to see that you have the necessity to mix up with your overpairs. So you can't just barrel all the time with your overpairs. So you see aces mixing heavily here, queens mixing fairly often. This might appear strange, but queens has the blockers to ace queen, and villain has ace queen off in his range pretty much always. And ace queen off is almost always going to check back the turn. So you have pretty good blockers to your opponent's check back range, which is exactly what you want here. With queens, you want villain to put money into the pot. So having 2 queens reduces the likelihood of villain checking back the turn. So you check queens even more often than aces, because villain is going to stab with some ace-x here. Now, that's the first thing. You're going to have to find those checks with these hands. Because if you don't find checks with these hands, what's going to happen is you become very exploitable against stabs from the pocket pair region that wants protection. And let me tell you, humans love a protection bet. Okay, if there's one thing that people do more often than solvers is to protection bet. People really get out of control with their protection bets. And you see hands here like pocket eights checking back like 60% of the time, pocket sevens checking 45% of the time, even nines here checking 25% of the time. So people really do love a protection bet. And if you make yourself your checking range weaker than it should be, you immediately get exploited by the way population naturally plays, which is to overstab for protection. So you make your range overly weak, which is great for these hands as they're not going to get raised very often, and they may face more folds simply because your range is more air heavy than it should. But that's not the topic of what we're discussing here. What we're talking about is finding unnatural bluffs. And here you're going to see that, well, imagine you checked aces or queens or jacks here. Naturally, you're going to want to raise a small bet that villain is placing here. That small bet is mostly going to come from hands that you have basically dead. So hands like queens and kings are going to be pure check raises. Even a hand like aces